Out in the wind-whipped heart of Wyoming, where hope dries up faster than a spit on a hot rock, a county auction is about to change everything. This isn't your typical auction with prize cattle and fancy quilts. No, this is a debt auction, where men who've lost it all are sold off for a season of labor, their pride stripped bare under the unforgiving sun. Jovi Lane sits in the crowd, a widow with nothing left but cracked boots, a bone-dry well, and a loneliness so deep it feels like a second shadow. She watches as one broken man after another is sold off to settle his debts. Then they bring out Lot 17, and the whole crowd goes silent. He's too big for the platform, a giant of a man shackled at the wrists. A filthy, blood-streaked burlap sack is tied tight over his head, hiding his face from the world. Whispers crawl through the crowd like snakes in the dust. Some say he's a monster, that he snapped a U.S. Marshal's neck clean in two with his bare hands. Others say he's mute, hasn't spoken a single word in years. A feral beast found wandering the Badlands. The auctioneer starts the bidding. Silence. No one wants to buy a killer. No one wants to bring that kind of trouble home. The price drops, $20, $10. The auctioneer is about to call it, ready to hand the man over to the sheriff to be dealt with permanently. But then a voice cuts through the silence, small but clear. $5. Every head turns. It's Jovi Lane, the quiet widow, offering her last $5 for the man in the sack. The sheriff scoffs. The townspeople stare, their eyes a mix of pity and scorn. They think she's lost her mind, buying a monster for $5. But Jovi isn't looking at them. She's looking at the man on the platform. She doesn't believe the rumors. She doesn't know what she believes. All she knows is that something deep in her bones, a feeling older than memory, tells her she's seen this man before. The gavel falls. Sold. She brings him home to her failing farm, expecting nothing more than silence and sweat. A strong back to help with chores a woman alone can't handle. She leads him to the barn, cuts the ropes binding his wrists, and steps back. He stands there, perfectly still. "You can take the sack off now," she says, her voice steady. He doesn't move. She waits. The silence stretches, thick and heavy. Finally, she steps forward, her hands trembling just a little, and reaches up to untie the knot. The rough burlap scrapes against her fingers. She pulls it free. The sack falls away, and her breath catches in her throat. His face is a ruin of old scars, but his eyes are a piercing, familiar blue. They find hers across the dusty barn. He opens his mouth, and a voice rough from disuse speaks a single word, a word that shatters her world. "Jovi!" Her heart slams against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. Because 20 years ago, in the fiery, bloody aftermath of a wagon train massacre, a stranger had lifted her, a little girl, from the ash and smoke. He'd carried her to safety, whispered a promise to keep her safe, and then vanished like a ghost into the pines. Could this be him? Could the shackled giant she just bought for $5 be the ghost who once saved her life? Before we dig into what happened next, do me a favor and tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. And if this story already has you hooked, stick around. You're not going to believe where it goes. In a town like Bitterbrush, gossip wasn't just a pastime, it was the only crop that ever grew. So when word got out that Jovi Lane, the widow of Hayes Brewer, had spent her last $5 on the monster from the auction, the town didn't just whisper, they preached, they condemned. "She's a fool," some said, shaking their heads over checkers at the general store. "She's desperate," others clucked, pulling laundry from the line. Old Man Hemlock, who'd known her since she was a girl, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "She's trying to get herself killed, just to see her husband again." But none of them saw what Jovi saw. The man who she learned was called Ridge never spoke another word after that first day. He was a silent giant, moving through her world with a strange, careful grace. He moved like someone terrified of breaking something, as if every step he took carried a weight he didn't want to pass on. He fixed the leaning fence post with a single powerful twist. He rethatched the leaky barn roof in an afternoon. He worked from sunup to sundown, never asking for anything, never complaining. He was a phantom, a force of nature in worn-out trousers. On the third morning, Jovi woke to a sound she hadn't heard in 2 long years, a rhythmic creak and a groan, followed by the impossible splash of water. She rushed to the porch window. There was Ridge standing by the well that had gone bone dry the same week her husband Hayes had died. Hayes had tinkered with it for a month, finally declaring it broken beyond repair, a casualty of the drought, just like their farm, just like her life. But Ridge was there, his back to her, pumping the handle. And with each pull, a stream of cold, clean water gushed into the trough. He hadn't even asked her about it. He had just seen a problem and fixed it. She watched, stunned, as he finished. He didn't look toward the house, didn't wait for a thank you. He just wiped his hands on his trousers and walked back toward the barn, as if bringing a dead well back to life was the kind of thing any man might do before breakfast. The silence in the house suddenly felt different. It wasn't empty anymore. It was watchful. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Jovi sat at her small kitchen table with a flickering candle and an old family Bible, its spine so worn it had forgotten how to stand straight. Tucked inside, between the Book of Psalms and a pressed lavender sprig from her girlhood, was a photograph. She hadn't looked at it in 20 years. She pulled it out. The image was faded, the corners soft with age. 7 children covered in soot and ash, huddled together after the raid. And behind them, taller than anyone else, his face lost in shadow but his presence unmistakable, stood the man who had carried her through the carnage. She had been 12 years old, the only girl left alive after a band of rogue soldiers, drunk on whiskey in a war they refused to believe was over, had torn their world apart. He had appeared from nowhere, a ghost from the pines, lifting her into his arms, shielding her from the sounds of screaming that would haunt her dreams for years. He'd carried her across Silver Creek as bullets whizzed past their heads, whispering strange words she hadn't understood then, but had never ever forgotten. She'd always assumed her mother, who she thought had survived and moved away, had mailed her the photo later. But in the flickering candlelight, she saw something she'd never noticed before. Faintly scrolled on the back, almost invisible now, were a few words. Taken by Sister Margaret. Sent to Jovi in care of Bitterbrush Mission. It hadn't been her mother. Her mother had died that day, along with everyone else. Her breath hitched. A nun had taken the photo. A nun had sent it to the mission where Jovi had spent the next few years. Her whole understanding of her own past shifted, like the ground cracking beneath her feet. She turned the photo over again, her heart hammering against her ribs. The face in the background, stoic and half-shadowed, was the same man who had just fixed her well. There was no doubt. Not anymore. At dawn, she walked to the barn. She didn't knock. He was sitting on an overturned bucket near the door, sharpening a broken sickle with a whetstone, moving with a patient, rhythmic scrape. He looked up as she entered, his blue eyes calm, questioning. She didn't say a word. She couldn't. She simply held the photograph out in front of him. He stopped his work. He looked down at the faded image in her trembling hand. His gaze lingered on it for a long time. Then slowly he reached out a calloused finger, not to take the photo, but to gently press it over the small figure in the center. A little girl in a torn dress, eyes wide with a grief too big for her face, clutching the arm of the giant behind her. Jovi looked up at him, her heart thudding one. Hard. Beat. "You were there," she whispered. It wasn't a question. He looked from the photo to her face, and his eyes held 20 years of unspoken history. He nodded, just a single, slow nod. No words, no need for them. In that single gesture, she knew. The monster, the killer, the man she'd bought for $5, was the angel who had saved her life. But as he held her gaze, she saw something else in his eyes. It wasn't relief. It wasn't nostalgia. It was a warning, as if to say, the past isn't as dead as you think. The feeling of connection, of a miracle, began to curdle into something else. Fear. Why would her savior end up in chains on an auction block? The rumors about the dead marshal came rushing back, louder and more insistent than before. One question echoed in the silent barn. Who was this man, really? The town of Bitterbrush didn't take kindly to mysteries, and Ridge was the biggest mystery they'd ever seen. The whispers started to get louder, sharper. Someone's chickens went missing from their coop, the wire torn open with what looked like brute force. Instantly, all eyes turned to Jovi's farm, to the silent giant in her barn. Then a few nights later, the fence at the Miller place was smashed to splinters. A prize bull wandered out onto the open range and was lost. The Millers were convinced it was Ridge. They said they'd heard a roar like a bear that night. It didn't matter that Ridge had been in the barn all night, a fact Jovi knew for certain. Fear doesn't listen to facts. Sheriff Cobb, a man who wore his authority like an ill-fitting suit, started paying visits. He'd ride up, his belly hanging over his saddle horn, and peer at Ridge with suspicion. "Heard about the Miller's bull," Cobb said one afternoon, not even looking at Jovi. His eyes were locked on Ridge, who was splitting firewood with terrifying efficiency. Man with that kind of strength could tear down a fence without breaking a sweat. Ridge didn't even pause. The axe rose and fell. Thwack. A log split perfectly in two. Cobb's eyes narrowed. "You stay watchful, Jovi. A snake's a snake, even if it helps around the yard." But Ridge's behavior was getting stranger. He barely slept. Some nights Jovi would wake to a floorboard creaking and see his massive silhouette slipping out of the barn and into the darkness. One moonless night, her curiosity got the better of her. She pulled on her boots, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and followed him. He moved silently through the fields, a shadow among shadows. He went to the far edge of her property, right where it bordered the open, untamed wilderness, and he just stood there. He stood for over an hour, perfectly still, staring out into the blackness. He wasn't looking at anything in particular. He was listening, waiting, as if he knew something was coming for him, and a few days later it did. A stranger rode into Bitterbrush. He wasn't like the local ranchers or dusty prospectors. He was lean and wiry, dressed in a long, dark coat despite the heat. His eyes were like chips of flint, cold and hard, and they missed nothing. He moved with the coiled deadliness of a predator. He tied his horse outside the saloon and went straight to Sheriff Cobb. Jovi heard about it from Sarah, her nearest neighbor, and the only friend she had left in town. Sarah had been in the general store when the stranger came in asking questions. "His name is Flint," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear as they sat at Jovi's kitchen table. "He's a bounty hunter, Jovi, a professional. He was asking about a tall man, a man with scars on his face." Jovi's blood ran cold. "He's looking for a killer," Sarah continued, her voice trembling. "A man they call the Preacher." Jovi frowned. "The Preacher? Not a feral beast, not a random brawler. A preacher?" The name didn't fit. "And Jovi, the man he's hunting is wanted for murder. Flint told the whole saloon. Said this preacher killed a man in Deadwood, a rich man, the son of a railroad baron." Jovi felt dizzy. A railroad baron's son? Not a U.S. Marshal? The rumors, the whispers, they'd all been wrong. The story was completely different. Why? Why would the story be so different? That night, a storm rolled in, the sky turning a bruised purple. Thunder rattled the windows of the small farmhouse. Jovi was on edge, every clap making her jump. Ridge was in the house with her, sitting by the cold hearth, watching the storm through the window. She had to know. She couldn't live with the silence anymore. "The town is scared of you," she began, her voice barely a whisper over the wind. "They say you're a killer. A bounty hunter is in town. He says you murdered a wealthy man's son in Deadwood." She looked at him, pleading. "Is it true?" Ridge turned from the window. His face was a mask, unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing. Jovi thought he would retreat back into his silence, leaving her alone with her fear. But then he reached into the pocket of his worn coat. He pulled out something small and held it out to her in the palm of his massive hand. It was a child's ribbon, sky blue, the edges frayed from being handled for years. Jovi stared at it, confused. What did this have to do with murder? And then she remembered. Just last week, Sarah's little girl, Lily, had been playing near the road. A freight wagon had come thundering past, one of its wheels hitting a rock. The wagon bucked, and a heavy barrel of nails had tipped, crashing to the ground right where Lily was standing. Jovi had screamed. But Ridge, who had been mending a fence 50 feet away, moved faster than she'd ever seen a man move. He covered the distance in 3 impossible strides, snatching Lily out of the way just as the barrel splintered on the spot where she'd been. He had saved her life, and tucked into Lily's hair that day had been a sky-blue ribbon, just like the one he now held in his hand. Lily must have given it to him. He closed his hand around the ribbon, his knuckles white, and then he finally spoke. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together deep underground. His name was Silas Croft, Ridge said, his eyes fixed on something far away. The man in Deadwood. He paused, the silence stretching. The things he was doing to children. The law wouldn't stop him. The law was in his pocket. The marshal, a man named Davidson, he took Croft's money and looked the other way. Jovi's breath caught. I went to talk to Croft, Ridge continued, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. To make him stop. He laughed. He bragged about it. He showed me what he was going to do to the next one. Ridge's gaze dropped to the ribbon in his hand. It wasn't a brawl, he said, his voice dropping even lower. It wasn't a fair fight. I made sure of it. The truth hit Jovi like a physical blow. He wasn't denying it. He was admitting it. He had killed Silas Croft. He had executed him. So he was a killer. But he'd done it to protect children, her protector, her savior, a man who would kill to defend the innocent. The moral lines blurred, turning into a confusing, terrifying gray. But one question still burned. If he killed a rich man's son, and the marshal was corrupt, where did the rumor about him killing a marshal come from? It didn't make any sense. Unless someone wanted the story to be told that way. Someone who wanted him seen not as a vigilante, but as a cop killer. The worst kind of outlaw. The next morning, the bounty hunter, Flint, made his move. He strode to the public notice board outside the sheriff's office and nailed up a piece of paper. A wanted poster. The ink was stark against the cheap paper. A crude, grainy sketch of a man with hard eyes and a strong jaw. It was unmistakably Ridge. And below it, the words that would turn the entire town into a powder keg. Wanted, dead or alive, Jonah McKenna, alias the Preacher, for the murder of Silas Croft. Reward $500, $500. In a town like Bitterbrush, that was a fortune. It was enough money to buy the best farm, to start a new life. It was enough to turn neighbors into enemies, to turn decent men into a lynch mob. Jovi saw it from across the street. Her heart sank. The name. Jonah McKenna. The Preacher. She raced back to the farm, her mind reeling. When she burst into the kitchen, Ridge was there, a piece of leather in his hands, mending one of her old boots. He looked up, and he must have seen the terror in her eyes because he slowly put the boot down. They know, she whispered, breathless. There's a poster with your face on it. He simply nodded as if he'd been expecting it. They call you the Preacher, she said, the name feeling strange on her tongue. Why? For the first time, a flicker of something that might have been pain crossed his face. He reached inside his shirt and pulled out a small, worn wooden cross that hung from a leather cord around his neck. Its surface was worn smooth by what must have been countless years of handling. The war, he said, his voice quiet. I was a chaplain. I didn't give many sermons. He looked down at his own massive, scarred hands. I just pulled boys out of the mud, carried the wounded, buried the dead. He had been a man of God in the middle of hell, and the name had stuck. But Flint wasn't just posting notices. He was poisoning the well. He spent the day in the saloon, buying drinks, telling stories. He painted Ridge not as a protector, but as a bloodthirsty monster who had butchered young Silas Croft in cold blood over a card game. He conveniently left out any mention of children. He told them about the $500 reward, and he told them that the crazy widow Lane was hiding the killer in her barn. By sundown, the mood in Bitterbrush had turned ugly. Men who had nodded politely to Jovi just yesterday now glared as she passed. They were looking at her farm with hungry eyes. $500 was a powerful motivator. Sheriff Cobb, smelling money and a chance to be a hero, officially sided with Flint. He started deputizing men, handing out old rifles from his office lockup. Jovi's small farm was no longer a refuge. It was a target. That night, Ridge came to her. He was holding a small, rolled-up blanket and a satchel. He was going to leave. No, Jovi said, standing in his way. You can't. They'll hunt you down. That's the point, he said, his blue eyes filled with a deep, aching sadness. I'll lead them away. Flint, the posse, they want me, not you. If I'm gone, they'll leave you be. I'm not letting you go, she insisted, her fear making her bold. We'll face them together. He looked down at her, and for a moment the hard mask slipped. She saw the weary soldier, the haunted chaplain, the man who had been fighting for too long. Jovi, he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. Some storms you can't ride out. You have to lead them away from the ones you care about. He was going to sacrifice himself to save her, just like he had all those years ago. He turned to leave, and in that moment of pure desperation, an image flashed in her mind. A memory of her late husband, Hayes. Hayes had been a good man, but a haunted one. He'd come to Bitterbrush a broken shell of his former self, and he had a secret, a small locked drawer in the bottom of his old roll-top desk. Never open this, Jovi, he'd told her once, his eyes dark with a fear she didn't understand. Promise me. She had promised, but Hayes was gone, and she was desperate. Wait, she told Ridge, her voice tight. Don't go, not yet. She ran into the small study, her heart pounding. She knelt before the desk and pulled at the small brass knob drawer. Locked, solid. She looked around frantically, spotted the fireplace poker. Without a second thought, she jammed the tip into the keyhole and pried. The old wood splintered and groaned. With a sharp crack, the lock gave way. Her hands shaking, she pulled the drawer open. It wasn't filled with money or a hidden pistol. It was filled with paper. Old, yellowed case files. She pulled them out. The handwriting was her husband's. She started to read, and the world tilted on its axis. Before he was a broken-down farmer, Hayes Brewer had been a deputy U.S. Marshal. And the files, they were from an investigation he'd been working on. An investigation into a string of disappearances along the new railroad line. An investigation into a human trafficking ring that was kidnapping immigrants and selling them as forced labor. And the names in the file made her blood freeze. The entire operation was being run by the Croft family, and it was being protected by a corrupt local marshal named Davidson. Hayes had gotten too close. The last entry in the file was a hastily scrawled note. They know. Davidson threatened me. Have to get Jovi out. He hadn't just quit his job. He had run for his life. He had brought her to Bitterbrush to disappear, to hide. His spirit hadn't been broken by the farm. It had been shattered by the evil he had uncovered and been powerless to stop. And then she saw it, tucked at the very bottom of the file, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it. Another photograph. This one was newer, crisper. Two men standing side by side in front of a marshal's office. They were younger, full of confidence. One of them was her husband, Hayes. The other was Ridge. They were both wearing the five-pointed star of a deputy U.S. Marshal. They weren't just strangers who had crossed paths once in a tragedy. They were partners. The questions exploded in her mind, one after another, each more terrifying than the last. Did Ridge know Hayes was here? Was he looking for him? And the most terrible question of all, Hayes's death. He'd fallen from the barn loft while trying to fix the roof. A tragic accident, everyone had said. But now she wasn't so sure. The well hadn't just gone dry. Someone had sabotaged it. The fence posts hadn't just rotted. They'd been weakened. Small things, designed to make a farm fail, to make a man give up, to break him down piece by piece. Her husband hadn't died in an accident. He'd been murdered. She ran from the house, the photo and the files clutched in her hand. She burst into the barn where Ridge was preparing to leave. She shoved the photo into his face. You knew him, she cried, tears streaming down her face. You knew my husband. Ridge stared at the picture of him and Hayes, his face turning to stone. The weary resignation in his eyes was replaced by a raw, ancient grief. He slowly looked up at her, and the whole terrible truth came pouring out. We were partners, he said, his voice thick with emotion. We were building a case against Croft and his whole operation. Hayes was the brains, I was the muscle. We had them. We were days away from making the arrests. But someone on the inside, a clerk in the federal office, had tipped them off. They went after Hayes first, Ridge choked out, the words tasting like ash. Tried to make it look like an accident on his ranch. A spooked horse. It broke his leg, but worse, it broke his spirit. He thought they'd come for you next. So he ran. He took you and disappeared. He made me promise not to follow, not to bring the trouble to his doorstep. Ridge had honored that promise, but he hadn't given up the fight. He'd gone deeper undercover. He let himself get disgraced, drummed out of the marshals. He created the persona of the preacher, a dangerous drifter, a phantom who could move through the underworld, gathering the final pieces of evidence they needed. The murder of Silas Croft. It was a trap, and Ridge knew it. Silas had a group of children locked in a boxcar, ready to be shipped out, Ridge explained, his voice a low growl. I was the only one who knew where. It was a setup by Marshal Davidson to get rid of me. I had a choice. Let the children disappear forever, or walk into the trap. He had walked into the trap. He'd gotten the children to safety, but Davidson's men were waiting for him. They'd beaten him, framed him for Silas's murder, and thrown him in jail. The auction? That had been Davidson's twisted idea, a way to get rid of the evidence, to sell him off to some remote mining camp where he would simply disappear for good. It was a sick joke. I never expected to see you there, Jovi, he said, his voice ragged. When I heard your voice, I thought I was dreaming. He crossed the barn to a loose stone in the foundation wall. He pulled it free and reached deep inside the hole. He pulled out a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He unrolled it on the hay-strewn floor. Inside was his own Deputy U.S. Marshal badge, tarnished but unmistakable, and next to it, a thick leather-bound ledger. Hayes's files were the start, Ridge said, tapping the ledger. This is the proof. Every name, every date, every bribe paid by Croft to Davidson and his men. It's all in here. I was supposed to get this to the territorial marshals in Cheyenne, but they arrested me before I could. He had allowed himself to be shackled, to be sold, to be called a monster. His silence hadn't been guilt. It had been duty. They had the proof, the files, the ledger, the badge. The whole rotten conspiracy laid bare. But just as a sliver of hope began to dawn, they heard it, the sound of hoofbeats. Dozens of them. Getting closer. A voice bellowed through the pre-dawn gloom. It was Sheriff Cobb. Jonah McKenna, come on out. You've got nowhere left to run. Flynn and the posse had arrived. The sun was just beginning to touch the horizon. They were out of time. The farm was surrounded. Torches flickered in the gray light, casting long dancing shadows. Jovi could see them from the window. Sheriff Cobb, the bounty hunter Flint, and at least a dozen men from town. Their faces grim, rifles held at the ready. It's over, Jovi, Cobb yelled. Send out the killer before someone gets hurt. Ridge stood behind her, his huge frame tense. Stay inside, he rumbled. This is my fight. No, she said, turning to face him. Her fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, blazing anger. They killed my husband. They destroyed our lives. This is our fight. Before he could argue, she walked to the front door, took a deep breath, and stepped out onto the porch. Alone, every rifle swung toward her. Sheriff Cobb, she said, her voice surprisingly steady, you're making a terrible mistake. The man you're hunting is not who you think he is. Save it, Jovi, Flint sneered from beside the sheriff, his flinty eyes glittering with greed. We ain't interested in stories, just the man. Send him out now. He saved my life, she said, speaking to the townsmen, to the men she'd known for years. He saved Sarah's little girl. Is that the work of a monster? A few of the men shifted uncomfortably. They knew Jovi. They knew she wasn't a liar. But the promise of $500 was a heavy weight on their conscience. Flint saw the hesitation. He knew he was losing control. He raised his pistol. Last chance. He wasn't aiming at the door. He was aiming at Jovi. Crack! A gunshot exploded in the quiet morning. Wood splintered from the porch railing right next to Jovi's head, showering her with debris. She cried out, stumbling back. That was it. The barn door burst open with the force of a cannon blast. Ridge charged out, not with a gun, but with a massive iron plowshare held in front of him like a shield. He roared, a sound of pure, untamed rage, and it wasn't the roar of a monster. It was the roar of a protector. He was drawing their fire, creating a diversion. Chaos erupted. Gunshots echoed across the valley. The posse, startled by Ridge's sudden appearance, fired wildly. Ridge used his immense strength and the plowshare to deflect their shots, trying to disarm them, not kill them. He was a whirlwind of controlled violence, a giant fighting a dozen smaller men. From her kitchen window, Sarah, the neighbor whose daughter Ridge had saved, saw the whole thing. She saw the guns. She saw Ridge defending the farm. She saw Jovi trapped. Without a second thought, she ran to her own barn, threw a saddle on her fastest horse, and galloped away, not from the fight, but towards the telegraph station 5 miles down the road, praying she could get there in time. The fight in the yard was brutal. Ridge took down 3 men without throwing a single punch, simply by disarming them and shoving them into the dirt. But there were too many. A shot rang out from Flint's pistol. It caught Ridge high in the shoulder. He staggered, the iron plowshare falling from his grasp with a heavy thud. He dropped to one knee, blood seeping through his shirt, his face pale with pain and effort. Flint and Sheriff Cobb advanced, triumphant smiles spreading across their faces. The posse slowly closed in, forming a tight circle. It was over. "Looks like your little preacher's all out of miracles," Flint gloated, raising his pistol, aiming for the kill shot. "That's far enough." The voice came from the porch. They all turned. Jovi was standing there again. But this time she was holding something. Her late husband's old double-barreled shotgun. She held it with a familiarity that surprised everyone, including herself. But it wasn't the shotgun that made them freeze. It was what she threw from the porch. A leather-bound bundle that landed in the dust at Sheriff Cobb's feet. "Pick it up," she ordered, her voice ringing with an authority no one had ever heard from her before. Hesitantly, Cobb knelt and picked up the bundle. It fell open. He saw Hayes's old case files. He saw the badge. And then he saw the ledger. He started reading. His face, flushed with victory just moments before, turned a sickly ashen white. He flipped through the pages, seeing names, dates, amounts. He saw records of bribes, of extortion, of murder. And then he saw his own name, mentioned 3 times next to small payments for ignoring freight wagons that passed through his county in the middle of the night. He wasn't a hero about to bring in a wanted killer. He was a fly, caught in a spider's web so large and so deadly he hadn't even known it was there. He looked up from the ledger, his eyes wide with terror, not at Ridge but at Flint. Flint's face had twisted into a mask of pure fury. The game was up. He lunged, not for Ridge but for the ledger, to destroy the evidence. But before he could take a step, a new sound cut through the air. Hoofbeats, fast, organized. A line of riders appeared over the crest of the hill. They weren't a raggedy posse. They were uniformed men, riding with purpose, rifles held at the ready. Territorial U.S. Marshals. The lead marshal, a grim-faced man with a thick gray mustache, dismounted. He strode into the yard, his eyes taking in the scene. Ridge on the ground, Jovi with the shotgun, Cobb holding the ledger like a venomous snake. He didn't even glance at Ridge. His eyes locked onto the bounty hunter. "Elias Flint," the marshal's voice boomed. "You're under arrest on a federal warrant for conspiracy, kidnapping, and the murder of Deputy Marshal Hayes Brewer." The townsman gasped. Murder of Hayes Brewer? The lead marshal turned to the stunned posse. "And Marshal Davidson was taken into custody in Deadwood less than an hour ago. He's told us everything." The final devastating twist landed. Flint wasn't just a bounty hunter. He was the Croft family's head enforcer. The $500 bounty was a lie, a smokescreen he'd created himself to give him the legal authority to hunt Ridge down and kill him. He was never going to bring him in alive. He was here to silence the last witness. Seeing his whole world collapsing, Sheriff Cobb made the only choice he had left, to save his own skin. "He's resisting arrest," Cobb yelled, tackling the stunned Flint from the side, trying to look like he'd been on the right side all along. The fight was over. The truth was out. The townsmen, realizing how close they'd come to helping a murderer kill a federal marshal, lowered their guns, their faces a mixture of shame and disbelief. The world had turned upside down, and Jovi Lane was standing right in the middle of it. The territorial marshals were efficient. They tended to Ridge's wound, took Flint into custody in irons, and took Sheriff Cobb's statement, making it clear his days as a lawman were over. The posse melted away, a dozen ashamed men slinking back to town, unable to look Jovi in the eye. Within an hour, the farm was quiet again. The only evidence of the morning's violence was the trampled dirt in the splintered porch rail. Jovi sat at her kitchen table, carefully cleaning and bandaging Ridge's shoulder. The silence in the room wasn't heavy or awkward anymore. It was peaceful, earned. "Hayes talked about you all the time," Ridge said softly, breaking the quiet. "Even after we were separated. He was so proud of your strength." Jovi felt a fresh wave of tears, but this time they weren't for what she had lost, but for what she was finally understanding. A few weeks later, a letter arrived from the Territorial Justice Department. The Croft-Davidson trafficking ring was completely dismantled. Ridge's name was officially cleared of all charges. Hayes Brewer was being posthumously decorated for his bravery. And enclosed with the letter was a new, gleaming Deputy U.S. Marshal badge, along with an offer for Ridge to be reinstated with a promotion. He read the letter, his face impassive. He looked at the shiny new badge in his hand. Then he looked around the small, quiet kitchen, at the sunlight streaming through the window, at the steady rhythm of the newly fixed well pump outside. He looked at Jovi. He folded the letter and placed it on the table. He put the badge next to it. He was done running. He was done fighting. That night, as Jovi boiled coffee on the stove, he placed something in front of her. It wasn't a letter or a badge. It was a small box carved from dark wood, worn smooth from being carried in a pocket for years. She opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of worn velvet, sat a silver band. Simple, plain, and solid. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. This wasn't a sudden proposal of romance. It was something quieter, deeper, a promise, a recognition. He hadn't bought it for a wife he'd never met. He'd carried it for years, a talisman, a hope for a possibility, for a day when he might finally be able to take off his boots without looking over his shoulder, for a place where he wasn't a myth or a monster or a fugitive, a place called home. Jovi looked from the ring to his face, to the eyes that had seen too much war and too much injustice. She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. She simply reached across the table and took his hand, his calloused, weather-worn, steady hand, the same hand that had once pulled her from a burning wagon, the same hand that had brought her dead well back to life. Now it was reaching for something new, something earned. She had walked into that auction with $5 and a heart full of ghosts. She had bought a man with a sack on his head, a monster surrounded by rumors. What she got in return was a protector, a past mended, a future rewritten. And as the sun rose the next morning over the Bitterbrush Hills, gold and wide and endless, she realized the simple, staggering truth. She hadn't saved him. He hadn't saved her. In the wreckage of their past, they had found each other, and together they had finally built a place where they could both be saved. If you made it this far, I want to know what you think was the biggest twist in Jovi and Ridge's story. Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey, do us a favor and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring that notification bell. We post stories like this all the time, and you won't want to miss what's coming next.